This is a joint session with the Society for Economic Research on Copyright Issues. And the intention of this session is to focus specifically on the economics of copyright and to introduce to EPIP people, participants I should say, the work that the Society has been doing since 2001. It's an academic platform for economists specializing in the economics of copyright, which includes both the application of economic theory and empirical research. We're a very open group. We are always open to new members, people coming along. We're very informal about those kind of relations, those kind of organizational aspects. We have a spectrum of work which is going to be presented in this joint session, and the CERSI annual conference is taking place alongside this, so there are papers tomorrow all day of the CERSI conference. Now, the theme we have chosen for the next two sessions is essentially around the remuneration of creators and the role of copyright collective rights management. These are topics that many of us have worked on over the years. And we start with Richard Watt's keynote paper, Copyright Collectives and Contracts, an Economic Perspective. Richard was the founder of CERSI, and at the same time, he wrote a path-breaking book, Economic Theory, Friends or Foes, which has been an inspiration for many researchers working in this area. I don't know how many foes he's made since then, but he's certainly made many friends, and one of them, I'm very glad to count myself as one of them. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this talk. The talk will be followed by respondents, Morten Hviid from University of East Anglia, Scott Walker from Performing Rights Society, and Sylvie Nerisson from the Max Planck Institute in Munich. And this panel will be followed straight away by a panel on compensating creators, which is going to be chaired by Marcel Boyer. So thank you very much.
Okay, well thanks everybody for coming, and excuse my voice because it's not very good these last couple of days, and I'll try and get by with this microphone. It will help a lot. So I was given the brief of saying something about copyright collectives and their contracts in that environment of collectives. And as a theoretical economist, that's a very enticing topic. But the difficult thing for me, I suppose, was to write something down and to get some messages across in an entirely non-mathematical framework, which is something that I'm not so accustomed to, but so I had a go. I hope it's at least informative or interesting for this audience. So essentially you have a standard theory of copyright collectives which is based on transaction cost savings and how lots of different users and lots of different creators can much more easily get together if there's a single transaction between them, because they're all wanting to use the same works, and all the works owners are wanting to use the same users, right? The other thing that comes out of the basic literature on copyright collectives is that there are three basic functions that these collectives play: licensing access, distributing royalty income, and enforcing against infringement. And what I thought was, well, if I tackle this problem of contracts, what can I say about these two things, right? The fact that transactions cost is the rationale for copyright collectives in the first place. And what about these roles of copyright? So as you'll see as we go through the slides, I'm going to add a completely different rationale for the raison d'être of the copyright collectors themselves. So why should they be there? A completely different take on that. It has nothing to do with transaction cost theory. And I'm going to add another role for the copyright collectors, that of risk management and insurance amongst the participants. Okay, so to cut a long story short, you look in the economic theory literature and you'll find a huge literature that started back in the 60s and has been ongoing ever since on what's known as the theory of collectives, the syndicates. So what is a syndicate exactly for an economist? And a syndicate, there's a definition here, right? Is you take a risky payoff and you have M agents, and the objective is to divide the risky payoff, that one risky sum of money, into M different little sums of money that add up to the total sum, such that each allocation to each of the agents is acceptable to him. That's a syndicate. But if you look at that and think about a copyright collective, that's exactly a copyright collective as well. What does a copyright collective do? It generates a sum of money, all right, big X, which is the risky payoff here, and that's generated by the sale of licenses to the repertory. And what it wants to do is to take that money and distribute it amongst the members of the collective, who are these M agents, in such a way that they're all satisfied with what they get. So a copyright collective is exactly a syndicate for a more general economics, or more general sort of economist, I suppose. And I wanted to use that analogy completely in what I do with you today. In this case as well, we've got, it clearly points out, I think, where there are at least two places that contracts are going to be important, and those are the two places I want to look at. One of them is, how do you generate that capital X surplus, or the money that's to be shared amongst the syndicate members? So there's some sort of contract between the collective or the syndicate and the users that ends up generating a pot of money to be distributed. So I'll look at those contracts, or something about those contracts, later on. The first place that I want to look at is the place where most of the economics literature has concentrated, and that is what contracts happen between the M agents. The contracts between the M agents are nothing more than those little numbers there. How is the total surplus to be divided amongst the M people? Well, there's an ex-ante contract between them that tells us what that should be, and that's the sharing rule. So there's a few issues that we can talk about with regard to the sharing rule. So how should it be constructed? What properties should the sharing rule have? That's the main thing that economists have looked at. Another important point is, to what extent is it true that decisions taken by the syndicate as a whole are actually going to be good for the individual members of that syndicate? So that's saying, to what extent is the syndicate able to be thought of as a representative agent for the members? The first question is all about efficient risk sharing, and that's been extensively tackled. There's a large literature on this in the risk sharing and insurance journals. And it should really serve us as a guide to what should be happening or could be happening within copyright collectives as well. And as I said, the second question is one of a representative agent. And the interesting thing is that the two issues are very, very closely related. And we'll see why. I'll tell you why in these slides here. So let's go with efficient risk sharing for a start. There's the basic premise that any economist will tell you, that if you want to have any sort of sharing syndicate happen, the rule or the set of contracts that govern how that distribution of income is done should be Pareto efficient. So it should be such that it's impossible to give a little bit extra money to somebody without giving a little bit less money to somebody else. It should be Pareto efficient in that sense. Nobody can be made better off without making somebody else worse off. And while that's a simple requirement to place upon a risk-sharing syndicate, it comes, and that alone actually determine a great many very important and strong results about how that set of contracts that determine how the aggregate surplus is shared, well, how that should happen. A very important first implication is something that in the insurance literature is known as the mutuality principle. And the mutuality principle, in a nutshell, says what I've got in that short bullet point. Each state of nature, in each state of nature, each syndicate member should receive a payoff that depends only on the aggregate surplus to be shared in that state of nature. That's it. So whatever is the amount of money to be shared in any given state of nature, so that's a number that changes in different states of nature, right? But once it's realised, that amount of money should be the only thing that determines what individual members of the syndicate each receive. So in particular, think about that. It says the amount of money that each individual syndicate member receives cannot depend upon the outcome of the aggregate surplus in a different state of nature. Right, so it can't depend upon that, and it also can't depend upon the outcome of each individual member's disaggregated lotteries. Okay, so I've got that on here, right? Concretely, and here's, sorry about that, here's a point that I made myself in a paper with a guy called Art Snow, who's a well-known economist working in the insurance world. What is Pareto inefficient is to risk pool, so get all of the risks together, add them all into a repertory, sell that repertory, have some money, and then monitor, especially pay money to monitor, pay costs and transaction costs to find out what was the outcome of each individual syndicate member's work, right? How much use was made of each individual work, and pay those individuals accordingly. That's totally inefficient. Why? Because all it does is, from a situation where risk could be shared, it places the risk straight back onto those individual members, where it could have been dissipated amongst them. So essentially, what should we do then to share this income? On what basis should this happen? And the idea would be, well, first and foremost, of course, we have that concept that the sharing rule must be such that each member is satisfied with what he gets. So there has to be a participation condition placed upon the sharing rule, not just Pareto efficiency. There has to be some participation condition. It still leaves a huge scope for different concrete sharing rules to happen. Presumably what would happen from there on is some sort of bargaining process that, given the constraints of, we want Pareto efficiency, we want individual participation constraints to be satisfied, you'd come to some solution, right? And that solution will not, or should not, have that feature in there if this is to be Pareto efficient. Okay. A few things that we can talk about. There's a focal contract, a real-world focal contract, which is that the sharing rule could be linear. A linear sharing rule is one simply where this is the aggregate surplus in state J, right? That's however much money we ended up having in given the outcomes of things that determine this pot of money. This is shared. So this is how much member I would get in that state J. He would get possibly an upfront payment, right? Possibly that could be zero as well, and he would get a fraction of the total pot of money as well. The important thing there is that fraction of money, that A fraction of money, is independent of the amount of money that's to be shared. This is like when two partners go into business as lawyers or something, and they decide to share the profits 50-50, regardless of whether the profits are large or small. Quite different story if they decide if profits are high, it's a 70-30 share, and if profits are low, it's a 30-70 share. Something like that is a non-linear rule. Non-linear rules are obviously much... a linear rule is a special case of a non-linear one. So it would be, in some sense, strange to see linear sharing rules, but what the economics literature has dealt with, and I'm not going to go anywhere near showing you proofs or anything like that, but I'll just tell you the result, that when is it true that the sharing rule should be linear? And the answer is, actually, this, which sounds bad, right? Everybody has to be of a given class of utility functions. They're called the hyperbolic absolute risk aversion utility class. Doesn't matter if you know what that means or not. It essentially contains a lot of normal looking utility functions that people use, and they must be all equicautious. They must have the same feeling against risk, okay? So a question that then we should ask ourselves is, does that describe a copyright collective? Well, I don't know. Nobody does know, and I don't know if it's possible to know, but at least if we were to say to ourselves, who are the members of a copyright collective? Well, individual copyright holders, perhaps creators, I don't know. Are they similar looking people? Are they, aside from, I'm sure you have firms as well as individuals, but take the individuals, just let me go there. Are they all at least similar looking sorts of people? Well, they must be to a certain extent relatively similar, because they all deal in the same, they've chosen the same profession, they do the same things, they're interested in the same field. So it's quite possible, I don't know how possible, but it's at least possible that they might all have a similar looking utility function, of a similar class at least of utility, and they might have similar feelings against risk. Nevertheless, it is a very strong restriction to place upon a problem, which is to say, most likely sharing would not be linear, but it might come close to linear, okay? Also, if you had a linear sharing rule, it tells you how much should a given outcome of the aggregate variable be shared? How should that be shared? What about aggregate risk? So the fact that in some states of nature the amount of money to be shared is larger than in others. That difference in aggregate income, how should that be shared? Again, it comes straight out of Pareto efficient risk sharing. And in a very influential paper, Wilson, 1968, shows that, essentially uses the mutuality principle all over again, shows that the way that should happen, the fraction of the change in wealth from one state to another, how much of a fraction should go to each of the individuals, is equal to the ratio of their risk tolerance to the group's risk tolerance, which is just a fraction, okay? And it's a really concise, easy rule to write down. Admittedly, probably not very easy to implement because you don't observe risk tolerances, but you could say, if everybody is similar, if they all would have the same risk tolerance, then you get a very nice focal point, which is that risk should be shared equally, 1 divided by n if there are n of them. So I guess we want to point out at least that that sharing rule for aggregate risk is, again, independent of the outcomes of any of the individual lotteries. It only depends on their preferences and their feelings towards risk, their appetite for risk bearing. Okay, that said, I want to talk about the effect upon that bunch of contracts, however they get signed, assuming that they get signed in a Pareto efficient manner, the effect of the law of large numbers, which is a very important question because it helps us to determine in this setup here what sort of size what sort of size the collective should be. How many members, how many works should be incorporated into that collective. So to do that, just consider two things. What a collective does, it pools risks together, risks being different works, right, which are risky lotteries, and then it should share the risks amongst the members. Quite likely in the real world at the moment as we stand, risk pooling does happen, but not much risk sharing, because I understand that they back out the risk back to the individual and pay him according to what actually happened to his particular song or work. But if risks were to be shared as well as pooled, then the law of large numbers gives me a very interesting conclusion. And that is the following, right? As you pull more and more risks together, basic statistical theory, so long as those risks aren't excessively correlated from one to the other, so if they're pretty much independent, then as you aggregate more and more of them together, you keep the average outcome of the aggregate variable, the average of the aggregate, retains its expected value but reduces its variance. So the whole thing gets less and less and less risky as you aggregate risks together, essentially. So that's got to be good news for each of the individual members. Assuming risk sharing does take place, then when more and more risks of similar or identical, hopefully, but similar at least nature are aggregated together, each member can be given the same expected payoff that they would have enjoyed in any other smaller syndicate, even perhaps to their own tiny syndicate, which is a one-member thing, but each time with less and less and less risk. And if they're risk averse, well, there's a huge savings there. So you want to add as much into the repertory as possible, or at least into the syndicate. We can see that in two different ways, the benefits that this gives us in two different ways, and I've written both of them up here, and we'll try and race through them rather quickly. In actual fact, if I make the assumption of perfect independence, so risks that are identical and independently distributed, so I'll take that as my baseline, okay? And if I take I can then say if they're independent and identical, they each have a given expected value and some variance, whatever that is. So each one of these songs, if it was marketed by itself, gives mu as expected licensing fee, if you like, and the variance of sigma squared. From the law of large numbers, the more and more of them I add together, well, the average aggregate surplus still has this expected value, but its variance decreases with n. It becomes variant, that individual variance, but divided by n. So the risk-sharing syndicate is able to give each member a better deal than acting alone. And the more members are added, the better is that deal. So for a syndicate of size n, each member would be willing to pay something to be in that syndicate rather than to act alone, because the syndicate gives them a better deal. It gives them the same payoff but with less risk. Because they're risk averse, well, they'll pay something to be in that syndicate. Let me say that they'll pay this much money, PN. The payment they would make is PN. There are n of them. The total payment that the syndicate can receive is capital PN, which is an amount of money that goes up every time n goes up, because n gets bigger, and P of n gets bigger as well as you add members, because the risk that each faces gets every time less, and so they're always willing to pay a little more the more members there already were. So this says the amount of money that the syndicate can accumulate is growing, and they become more and more profitable as a syndicate. This profit, of course, can be distributed back to the members. It can be dedicated to other things, whatever it does. But the money that they are worth grows the larger is the number of members. The other way to see this is the following. Imagine instead of just paying each member the average of the aggregate surplus, I actually did perfect risk sharing, and I paid them all exactly their expected value for sure. So I give all my members in this scenario zero risk. I give them mu dollars for sure. Okay? Now that they have zero risk as members, okay, who has all the risk? And that is the syndicate. In some instances, the syndicate who is paying out, where did I write it here? Here. The syndicate has n members, it's paying each an amount mu. Sometimes there'll be that money in the pot, because sometimes the aggregate outcome will be greater than n times mu. Sometimes it will be less. The syndicate as a whole faces a risk at that point. How does it finance this risk? I don't know, but risk financing, so going to a market, getting loans, financing that risk is a costly venture. However, the more members there are, the greater is N, the closer to N times mu is the outcome in the aggregate. The less risk there is, so the less need to finance risk there is. So that's the other, the other reason why that law of large numbers works nicely for predicting that. I'm okay. Predicting that the optimal membership of the syndicate should be as large as possible. Okay. Some interesting conclusions that we get from that. So if you have a more risky scenario as an individual, the more you're wanting to save on that risk. And so it becomes more important to aggregate risks together, not less. So even though I don't want to talk about transaction costs at all, and there is a literature that says digitization reduces transactions costs and may reduce the optimal size of a collective. This theory says quite the opposite. A decision rule happens to be, is that my card, my cue card? Yeah. The syndicates make decisions as well, and the decisions affect the aggregate variable that they're going to be sharing. So, to what extent can we know that that the syndicate is acting as a representative of the individuals? The answer is exactly the same as what was required for the linear sharing rule to be optimal. If everybody has equicautious utility functions in the same hierarchy class, then the syndicate as a whole has the same preferences, and so is a perfect representative. As you move away from that, well, you move away from the representative individual. So how far away depends on how far away from the class, or from that idea that you actually are. Okay, a couple of slides left, I believe, so I'll try and race through this before I do completely cough this thing out of here. What about the contracts between the CMO and the users? Now, there's two things to think about there. One is the pricing issue, and I'm not going to think about that. The other is, again, an aggregation issue, and since I've talked about aggregating members into a collective, let me talk about why should we aggregate works into a repertory and sell a blanket license rather than to try and sell smaller products. The answer as to whether or not that's a good idea is maybe, but it's probably less of a maybe than I think the reason why we want to aggregate members into the syndicate, although they're very related. And this comes out of this economics of bundling literature. Okay, what happens when you bundle several things together is that you are able to price at the average rather than the minimum. And here's a nice little example that is very commonly used, and I don't know if I've copied that out of somewhere or not, but everyone uses the same example. So if you have two users, user A and B, and two works, and this guy values the first work at $10, the second at $20, and this guy's the opposite. Well, if I don't bundle these things, I have two choices on price, $10 or $20. If I charge $10, both users will buy both works, and I'll get $40. If I charge $20, each user will buy only one work, and I'll still get $40. But if I bundle them together, I can market that bundle at $30, everyone will buy the bundle, and I'll get $60, right? I've sold the same thing, and I've managed to keep the consumers just as happy, and yet I've got $60 instead of $40. So that happens because the bundling allows me to charge at the average, not the minimum. And as you add more and more and more things into the bundle, that effect just goes on and on and on, and you get more and more of a concentration, and you get a better deal for all the time. Okay, an interesting thing, that idea is about earning money. So it's about the person selling, or the syndicate selling here, earning more profit. Of course, this benefit can be shared by price regulation, perhaps by bilateral negotiation. So I don't want you to take away the idea that the collective that bundles should be earning a huge profit at the expense of consumers. It's creating more surplus, I'm saying, that can be shared back amongst all of the market. Okay, I'll just flick this up, and I think whoops. I'll just flip. Can you wrap up? I will. The one thing I did want to mention was that the two effects in aggregation are just the same. It's all the law of large numbers. In membership of a collective, the law of large numbers just allows the average aggregate surplus to have a much lower variance. In the bundling story, as I said, the law of large numbers allows pricing at the average rather than the minimum, but they are both effects that derive out of the law of large numbers, and they both say you want to go as large as possible. Okay, I don't think these are the conclusions but this is repeating, right? Efficient contracts, everybody should have a payoff that doesn't depend on their own individual outcome. And I think that's important. The more members that you get into a collective, the better off you are. The digital revolution probably, at least I think, there's a strong argument, at least, for the digitization to lead to larger collectives, not smaller. The collective might be a representative agent. It depends on their utilities. And bundling of repertory into a single licensing unit, in principle, does the same. It's a handy profit maximising sort of a thing to do. Okay, so is that wrapped up?
Thank you very much.
I really like the idea of thinking about CMOs as a syndicate, or maybe even better, as a cooperative. And I fully agree that such organizations can best be thought of as a nexus of contracts. I think that's the right way to think about it in the Williamsonian sense. So I like that. I think you can push that much further, actually, because if you look at some of the co-op literature, you'll see some more stuff that you can work in there that will strengthen the paper. I also like this sort of fresh approach to how we think about organizing collective rights management. So stepping away from that, in a sense, even heretically think that we wouldn't need regulated institutions if what they're all about is risk sharing. It's certainly not obvious. Now, what I'm less convinced about is the emphasis on risk sharing. Now, this may be because I misunderstood some of the underlying assumptions, so I apologize if that's the case. But the way I kind of saw it was that essentially each artist goes to a common distribution, picks out a number, and that's the song they've got. And then that's either a hit or it's not a hit, so, you win some, you lose some. Now, that means essentially that music or the songs are all inspiration and no perspiration. That certainly isn't true, at least not my experience about research. There may be a little bit of inspiration here, but mostly it's perspiration. And I suspect that's true of music as well. And if that's the case, then that may make a difference. Now, of course, we all make simplifying assumptions. The concern is always that whether we've simplified away some important elements. And I think we might have here. Because, in a sense, by starting with this kind of picking the song out and not having any effort in there, it has a very ex post feel to it. Things have already happened, and now it's just a matter of flocking this product. There's no role for the creative process, yet copyrights that we're talking about is all about essentially encouraging that sort of process in the first place. So that's a little bit odd, but it more generally removes any issues surrounding incentives. And again, that's what copyright surely is all about. So that's also slightly odd. And then it does a third thing, which divorces risk allocation from incentive provision. It sort of occurred to me as I was listening to you that, yes, we have optimal risk sharing, But optimal risk-sharing contracts almost always, I think, generically probably true, have really bad incentive properties. And mostly, I mean, if you come at these things from a theory of the firm perspective, which I would probably do more likely, I would start with incentives, and then I would worry about having to somehow make sure that the risk allocation is okay. But it's more of a constraint than actually the main thing I would look at. So that worries me. I also, I mean, you put it slightly differently in your talk about digitalization. You make this comparison with libraries. I think the library, though, sounded to me a bit like an analog library, and I think the right one is actually a more electronic library, like Kindle Unlimited or Scripty or something like that. Now, they use more advanced contracts because they have more advanced information that a library could ever have. The old library would just know whether you're taking the book out, not how many pages you've read, which scarily, at least scary to somebody as old as me, you know, they do know. I don't like the idea, actually, but there we go. Now, this matters because that means that we can have different sort of platforms and they can write more advanced contracts. And that may again matter for the cooperative. And that also makes one think about this sort of exclusivity thing that has to be there. We know cooperatives need to have some element of exclusivity to really function. I think that's one of the lessons that history has told us. And there's a similar element here, yet, for example, authors these days place their books on all sorts of different platforms. There is no exclusivity. And when we think about this sort of non-exclusivity, then you could leave a particular CMO. You could go somewhere else, potentially, if we had competition amongst them. And that means that you really do have to then start valuing what is being put in there. And again, we know from cooperatives that whenever they could measure quality, they changed the way they paid for things to reflect that. And the same essentially becomes possible with music, and so one would expect that as well. I'm close to getting my yellow card, so I will almost stop. I think, just to final two things, I think you're right about the two-sidedness, that probably isn't a big issue, except once we introduce more fancy contracts on either side of the market, that's not so clear. I'm not entirely convinced about the bundling. You sort of say, well, bundling is, we know they want to price discriminate. Therefore, we know they want diversion. Version means bundling things in different ways, and you wouldn't want to offer the global bundle. So I'm not quite sure where the thing is in there, but there is something there which I'm uneasy about. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Morten.
My bias is that I'm a nerd of collective management. As you hear, I'm French and quite impressed to speak here and now. I very much appreciated your paper, Richard, because I didn't understand the whole mathematical part of it, because my bias is also that I'm a legal scholar from the author's right field, but I loved it because it confirms my conclusion, the conclusion that collective management works mostly because of the blanket licensing, and also because the current challenge of collective management now in the European policy making is the implementation of the directive of 2014. This directive made the choice to foster the freedom of right holders and actually cut all the ropes that contracts of collective management organizations did in limiting the freedom of right holders to choose what they entrust the collective management organization. The enemy of aggregated repertoire and huge repertoire with a lot of authors and a lot of works is cherry picking, and the directive makes the cherry picking free and very much possible. Your paper is very precious to defend the traditional way of collective management organizations, because the directive says right holders should be free to do whatever they want with their rights and their and to choose which categories of rights they entrust to collective management organizations. The only limit to this freedom is the efficiency of the management, and your paper gives mathematical, serious, economic justification to limit this freedom. The other great conclusion that I understood from your papers is that the members of a collective management organization should look the same or have or be equally risk averse. And the other challenge that we have now in Europe concerning collective management organizations relates to the presence of publishers inside collective management organizations. We need publishers inside collective management organizations in order to have those aggregated repertoire. But I have no idea about economics and about the way you assess risk aversion. But publishers are salesmen, creators are guys of my kind, having difficulty to read contracts and being afraid of commit themselves and being bad in bargaining. In my opinion, a salesman and a person like me, so a salesman, a publisher, and a creator are totally differently risk averse. So your paper helps me to try to convince people I speak with that can be policymakers, and as we heard yesterday, policymakers prefer executive summary, short conclusion. Most probably MEPs will have the same difficulty as I had reading your mathematical developments, but at least you have wonderful, clear conclusions supporting the idea that we should distinguish among right holders and not always consider them all the same. Thank you.
I'm not an economist, and I'm not an academic either. I'm a part-time advisor to PRS, but I think that, I do have the opportunity to give a few brief observations, and I very much, welcome the contribution and its useful conclusion. There remain strong arguments for the efficiency of managing access to copyrights works collectively rather than individually in the digital environment. How you got to that conclusion, I'm not sure if necessarily on the substance I agree with, or I'm confused perhaps about some of those aspects, and I think we don't have the time to go into the details on the kind of the theory of the firm, the analogy with comparing CMOs to a library, and the dismissal of the two-sided market, which are in the substance of the report. And actually, you didn't present that, so it's probably not worth me going into detail on that, but we can talk about that aspect later. I think to get right to the core of it is discussing the CMOs being defined as a syndicate and the risk sharing. And, you describe the syndicate point because CMOs are, it says each individual contributes to the rights of a risky copyrighted composition. But in practice, I guess the members assign the rights to the CMO under the exclusive agreements, and members have the right to income attributable to those rights under the agreement, and would expect to receive, I guess, a variable payout based on the value, and that's the usage of those particular works. The incentive to join the collective to share the cost of agency, and in terms of the revenue sharing with other members, really the crux of it is the distribution rules that we have in place, which are freely available. And those principles must be applied and ensures that the representative preferences of the collective as a whole are considered and we distribute fairly. And those principles are fairness, accuracy, transparency and efficiency. Fairness, yes, I think fairness, accuracy, transparency, efficiency. And it's a very careful balance that we have to strike, and this is done with real great due consideration, and it has to be. But I think then the paper looks at how the determination of how exactly that the social or group surplus should be shared between the members, and explain that the members' payoffs on individual works is not pro ratio efficient. But I think that actually there's an argument that the paper fails to make the distinction between the inherent value of copyright and the surplus that results from the kind of collective bargaining process. So in other words, that if all copyrights were worthless and the only value derived from making them collectively available, that surplus would therefore be divided equally among the members. But who would then pay anything for worthless copyrights? And that's, I think, a really important point, that the fact in the real world, those distribution rules depend on the actual usage of those copyrights as a response to the issue. And we don't know explicitly how to distribute the surplus among the members. It's because we don't know how exactly to draw the distinction between the underlying value of the copyrights and the surplus generated by the efficiencies of collective management. I guess there's one other point to make just in the interest of time, and that's in the kind of size of the repertory, in which you look and consider what the optimal size is, the implication here being that, as you said, the more works are collected into the repertory, the lower the risk and cost of financing that risk faced by the CMO, and since risk is costly, it's efficient for the repertory to be as large as possible, and we should therefore welcome as many members into the repertory as possible. Well, I think that's what, in some respects, what PRS has done over the last 10 years. In 2005, we had 40,000 members. Now we're 110,000 members. But there's also invariably a kind of an associated cost to serve these new members, which in practice, quite a few of these members are actually inactive and not ending up actually then registering any further works. They don't use the website, they're not actually earning any money. So in effect, that equates potentially to a cost without any practical risk reduction, and that's a moot point. But and one could argue that's not necessarily the most efficient way for a collective to kind of operate, but I guess there are other associated benefits with pooling and the economics of aggregation. So overall, I think it's a really helpful contribution. I shared it with some colleagues, and they were certainly interested, but I say my own economic standing is very limited, so I leave it to the experts to really give the opinion.
Well, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you to Richard, and thank you for the comments. I think in view of the timescale, we should move on.